Executive Director of the Center for the National Interest. We're very pleased to have with us today a couple of real experts on Ukraine and Ukraine's complex relationship with Russia, and I think also actually experts on Russia. I think we'll have a good session. A little bit, even a little bit more timely perhaps because of some of the news out of Ukraine. I think President Poroshenko has been reaffirming his desire expeditiously to join NATO, and I understood that the Ukrainian government is about to, or may have already, told Russia that it wants to withdraw from the treaty of friendship that the two countries have had in the past. So a lot to talk about. We'll start first with Keith Darden to my right, who's an associate professor at American University's School of International Service and has done a lot of work on nationalism and related issues in the post-Soviet space. Keith will talk, I think, primarily about the situation. Charap on my left, who, as many of you know, is a senior political scientist at RAND, a former appointee in the Obama administration, where he was on the policy planning staff, and also a senior advisor to the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, and of course also in the past at the International Institute for Strategic Studies here in Washington and at CSIS. So we're very pleased to have both of them. Sam will focus on the Russia-Ukraine dynamic, the conflict, the negotiations, and where that might head. I've asked each of them to talk for hopefully not more than 10 minutes so we can have time for a good discussion. Keith,
Great.
Take it away.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me. People have been very bullish on Ukraine lately. Recently, in the last week, there was the Yalta European Strategy Forum. Bono attended. Mike McFaul came out singing the praises of Ukrainian democracy on the grounds that we're not sure who's going to be the next president, right? Which is always a good sign that you're not in in an authoritarian regime. And in some ways, they have good reason to be positive, right? If you look back 4 years ago, where we thought we might be now, the place that we're at is a little bit better than the worst case scenarios. The economy is stabilized to some extent. There's been no coup, no third Maidan. We haven't had extensive violence in places like Kiev or in western Ukraine. And Ukraine's borders are pretty much where they were 3 to 4 years ago. We haven't had movement, no more secessions. And the violence, although tragic, has not been as bad as it might have been. Russia hasn't done a full-on invasion, and we haven't seen an all-out war. Also, with the president running at about 8% in the current polls for the election, which is not very far away, there's no talk of a coup, and no talk of holding off those elections, which I think is really quite significant. This has led many to think that time is on our side in Ukraine, that Ukraine is stabilizing, Ukraine is getting better. Kurt Volker has recently stated that the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the occupation of part of its territory gave rise to a more united, pro-Western, nationalistic, and anti-Russian Ukraine than ever. Russia had a losing strategy, and now they're hoping for a favorable result for them in the future elections in Ukraine. But again, I think that they miscalculated. The country is changing. No politician has a chance to win elections and run the country if he gives up Crimea and the Donbass or turns back from the European path of development. And this has become something of a consensus opinion, that Ukraine is on a positive trajectory, Russia is on a negative trajectory, and that essentially time is on our side. Historically, optimism has been a bad thing for peace. classic work by Blaney on the causes of war. He identifies optimism as the primary impediment to peace, that sides that think that they're on an upward trajectory are much more likely to engage in conflict, much less likely to settle, because they think the future is likely to be better than the present. And as a result, you get a very dangerous environment where if you feed this optimism, you increase the likelihood of a prolonged conflict. So I see our job today as limiting that optimism. As a way of contributing to peace.
Pessimism in the cause of peace.
That's right.
Spoken like a true realist.
Right. And Blaney, a wise man, also said that, doubt was always seen as the voice of the enemy. And therefore, it was generally incomprehensible. And so I'm hoping that we can make a comprehensible case for pessimism today and not be seen as the voice of the enemy. Although the climate these days often puts us in that camp. Okay. We'd like to undercut several assumptions that underpin this optimistic scenario today. And Sam's going to take care of the international side, and I'll look at the domestic side. One is that Russia's growing weaker over time. Two is that the Ukrainian military is getting stronger. Three, and this is the area that I'll address, Ukrainians are more united and have a stronger national identity with a pro-Western orientation. Four, that Ukraine has been challenged as a sovereign state, but it's proven its viability at this point, that it is a stable and going concern. And five, that external support for Ukraine is likely to continue, if not increase. Six, that sanctions and other costs for Russia will increase over time and make Russia yield in the negotiations eventually. Okay, again, Sam's going to cover the international. I'll focus on the domestic. And I think there are three essential facts about Ukraine that get lost in the optimistic scenario and that are grounds for pessimism. Number one, the country is regionally divided in a way that threatens its territorial integrity. And this has not changed. It is divided in a way that, if not managed, it could further fracture. Two, Ukraine, as we all know, is deeply corrupt. But Ukraine, unlike many countries, is corrupt in an unsustainable way. And this is a key point that I want to make, that Ukrainian corruption is not making it viable over time. Many countries are corrupt in a viable fashion. Saudi Arabia, Russia. Right? Ukraine is not. Three, Ukraine is unstable. And its political instability isn't decreasing over time. And we see this in the polls. The population senses instability. But also, uncertainty surrounding elections in Ukraine isn't a sign of democracy. It's a sign of political instability. And I think that that is the same Article 5 protections that the Baltic states have. You would think that there would be a general agreement that strong external support from the most powerful states in the world would be a good thing. Not true for Ukraine. The most recent poll from the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, which was conducted between August 30th and September 9th, with over 10,000 respondents, right, huge poll so that they could get all the regional variation, showed that less than half the population supports a vote for NATO membership, that would support NATO membership if a referendum had been held this month. Right? Less than half. More important, it's less than half the population, but it cleaves wildly in the regional divisions along predictable lines. 25% would support NATO membership in the east, 21.5% in the south. The east-center region, so the left bank of the Dnieper River, 35.6%. The west of the center, so the right bank, 55.6% support. So a majority supports on the right. In the west of Ukraine, 72.4%. And in Kiev, 60.3%. These polls are very important because a lot of us go over to Kiev, where 60% of the population supports NATO membership, but that is not reflective of the majority of the country, and it's certainly not reflective of some very powerful minorities in the country in the south and the east. And so the issue of NATO membership, and Poroshenko is putting this forward in an amendment to the Constitution, that the Constitution should be amended to state that Ukraine should be a member of NATO and the European Union, right, which shows how Ukrainians think about constitutions, but that's another point. When these are salient issues, the country is going to split, right? And in 2014, 2015, Poroshenko handled these splits rather well. You recall, back in 2014, he was elected as the candidate of peace. as a moderate candidate. He won majorities in the south and the east of the countries, and in Vienna, his home province, which he effectively owns. Right? He did not win in the west and center, in the pro-NATO areas. Right? He is pushing a line now that really divides the country in a way that is quite dangerous. Okay, point 2. The country's deeply corrupt. And corrupt in a way that makes it dependent on external assistance, in particular. As I said, Ukraine's not like Saudi Arabia. It's not like Russia. It doesn't have resources, essentially, that are stealable by the state or by public officials. What it has is the state budget. So Ukrainian corruption takes the form of various complicated schemes to siphon money out of the state budget. In the past, one of the primary mechanisms for doing this was the gas trade, both through creating companies to skim off the top of trade between Russia and Ukraine and Russia and the West, but also the domestic gas tariff. If the state subsidizes prices for gas domestically, then you have access to that gas and can sell it for a higher price internationally, then you make quite a bit of money, but the state takes a loss because it is paying for that subsidized price. The IMF has worked very hard to undermine the system, as has the U.S. government. There was an agreement in principle 2 days ago to end the subsidization of domestic gas, but that's happened many times in the past, and we've never actually seen this carried through. And so there's a real danger that this is going to happen again. Control over state-owned corporations is the other primary method for siphoning money from the state. So if you are politically connected, you can be in control of a state-owned corporation, run it at a profit for yourself, but at a loss for the corporation. And because they're state-owned companies, and most large enterprises in Ukraine are still state-owned, the losses go on to the state's books, and the gains go on your private income in Cyprus. And as a result, right, and this happens the same thing with the banks, the state will bail them out for their bad loans. The result is that the state goes deeper and deeper into debt. You get private connected wealth of the political class and the oligarchs, right? But over time, this is not sustainable, right? The state ultimately has to pay its debts, right? You can't steal from the state indefinitely if the state has no source of revenue. So what happens? Historically, either we or the Russians have bailed them out. So the Russians have forgiven a lot of debt in the past. They're not likely to do that now. We have forgiven debt. The IMF has been fairly forgiving in the past in giving Ukraine low-interest loans to cover its debt, but they've taken a much harder line of late. And Ukraine's going to have to cover $40 billion in debt servicing and repayment over the next several years. Right? Currently, net reserves are about $7 billion in the National Bank. That's not viable. Right? So either they're going to get an infusion of cash from the outside, or they're going to default, and the system is finally going to break. That's not a sustainable trajectory over the long haul. Time is not on their side. The U.S. government has gotten wise to this too, and we put quite a bit of pressure on Ukraine, because ultimately, as a country without extractable resources, or with few of them, Ukraine is going to have governance that is going to attract people to invest, to produce. It's not going to be an extractive regime, but they have refused to do that over the past few years, right? Despite the fact that they had, a revolution that put essentially a pro-reform government in power. They've chosen to continue the old system and just distribute the spoils among a political class. Now, that may have been essential to keeping places like Kharkiv and Odessa inside Ukraine, that there were deals that were struck between Poroshenko and regional oligarchs that made everybody happy, but this is not a sustainable solution for the long term. How does this fuel the conflict in the Donbass, rather than just decrease the viability of Ukraine? Well, one way that Ukraine has historically gotten assistance is by raising the sense of its geopolitical importance and the nature of external threat. So if Ukraine is the bulwark against an expansionist Russia, right, Congress is much more likely to give Ukraine funds, to fuel money back into this system that gets, so that is siphoning money out to the oligarchs. And that might be through defense spending, but all of this is fungible in the end. And so by increasing the threat or not resolving the conflict, there's a set of perverse incentives here where Ukraine gets more money from abroad, the less likely it is to get the resolution on its territorial integrity that would be necessary for peace. It's less likely to make those concessions because actually it benefits from not making any concessions. It benefits from a simmering conflict. Okay. 3, Ukraine remains highly unstable. Lucan Way has described Ukraine as a case of what he calls pluralism by default. In other words, this is not democratization. It's just continually failed authoritarian regime building. The country is so fractious that essentially you can't build a consistent and pyramid of power. And that's about right. But the danger is that this process is marked by periods of genuine political instability and risk. Right? So every time there is a potential of a change in power, because wealth comes from political connections to the leader, you're going to see, it's a very winner-take-all kind of system. So in this election, right, if it looks like Yulia Tymoshenko is going to win and Poroshenko is going to lose, all the private deals that Poroshenko has established, all the sort of pseudo-property rights that he's given to politically connected people, all that's going to be null and void when Yulia shows up as president, right? And a lot of people will have a very serious vested interest in kicking over the table if they lose that game. And this happened in 2004. It happened before the election in 2013, 2014. And it's not unlikely to happen again. These punctuated crises are a feature of Ukrainian politics. The most recent poll, this Kiev International Institute of Sociology poll, they asked about the situation in the country, the population. People were given a choice of whether they could describe it as stable, tense, or explosive. 7% said stable, 67% said tense, and 24% said explosive. About the same percentage, about a quarter of the population, said they thought that major mass mobilization was likely and that they would support it. Okay, so this is not a good set of arrangements if you're thinking about attracting investment, if you're thinking about the long-term stability of the country, and particularly if you have a neighbor that gets involved in the internal affairs and tries to tip the scales in the direction of instability. In the most recent poll, we really don't have a winner, right? So Yulia Tymoshenko is leading, but in this most recent Kiev poll, she's getting 11% from the population, right? Most people aren't going to vote. The majority of people are not going to. The largest or plurality of the people are not going to vote or are undecided, but 11% is not high. Poroshenko's getting 7%, Zelensky 6.7%. Bakarchuk, 6.5%. I mean, they're all really in the single digits. That level of decentralization, this late in the game, close to an election, presents just a lot of political risk. And this is a country that doesn't deal with that political risk very well. Okay. To add to this, the election itself is raising the cleavages that split the country. Right? So Poroshenko, to try and bolster his support, is running with the slogan, army, language, and faith, right? 2 out of 3 of those things are very divisive issues in Ukraine, right? And both the constitutional amendment about the European orientation of the country and his efforts to facilitate the creation of an autocephalous church of the Kiev Patriarchate to essentially take the property away from the Moscow Patriarchate on the territory of Ukraine, this is fire. In a Ukrainian political context, right? These are not the sort of things that are easily forgotten. And it's very likely to make this more of a winner-take-all election for significant portions of the population and lead to levels of resistance, levels of violence, potentially. And unless you manage those divisions in Ukraine carefully, as Poroshenko did the first time he ran, the potential for significant splits in the population are very likely. Let's pass that. After that optimistic note, I will pass over.
I'll just make one personal representatives of the American business community there, and among other other things, they told us that I think it's the American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine, I forget the name, they survey their members annually about a variety of issues, including corruption. Seeing that.
That's a good note of optimism.
Saying,
Thanks, Paul, for the
that one stuck with me, I will say. That one stuck with me.
well, thanks for the invitation. There's a lot of expertise in this room on the subject, so I'll try to be brief. I'm going to talk about the external environment and some of the assumptions underlying the optimism in that context. Starting with, probably not quite in the same order that Keith mentioned them, but nonetheless. So I'll start with the assumption that you hear in reference to this optimism about Russia's future. Often the optimism comes along with this idea that Russia is weakening over time and will be forced to change its policies in Ukraine as a result. So we have a fresh IMF staff consultation report on the Russian economy that was issued about a week ago. And basically the bottom line is that Russia has recovered from the recession of 2015-2016, and output was up in 2017 by 1.5%. Inflation in mid-2018 has hit a post-Soviet low of about a little bit over 2%, and growth is expected to settle around 1.5% over the medium term. So we're not talking about a runaway period of growth such as the one that Russia experienced from 2000 to 2008, but this is not an economy on the verge of collapse. In fact, it seems likely to be able to sustain growth rates of 1 to 2% over the medium to long term, basically for the foreseeable future that the IMF economists can forecast. In terms of the fiscal situation, so from 2016 to 2017, the overall budget deficit decreased from 3.6% of GDP to 1.5%. Due to some significant fiscal restraint in Russia and, of course, the increase in the oil and gas price. But given that now oil prices are higher than the benchmark that's built into the Russian budget, we're likely to see a surplus, according to the IMF this year. In other words, Russia does not have a fiscal crisis anywhere near on the horizon. To sum up, there is no medium-term prospect of Russia weakening to the point where it will be forced to change its either federal spending priorities or collapse in some way, whatever that might mean. And in fact, the response, the macroeconomic policy response to the 2014-2016 economic downturn, which of course involved unprecedented external economic shocks between the drop in the oil price and the Western sanctions, demonstrated that there is a decent amount of resilience in the Russian economy, particularly given the prudent macroeconomic management. So clearly this is not a picture of an economy that's about to take off to Chinese levels of growth by any means. It has a lot of structural problems, which the IMF report clearly identifies. But the assumption built into the optimism about the future of this conflict and how it might go is, I would argue, not supported by the evidence. A second assumption that the optimism is based on is that the both transatlantic and intra-EU consensus on Russia sanctions related to Ukraine will last indefinitely, or will last up until Russia is forced to make concessions. So putting aside for a moment the question about the effectiveness of sanctions in this context, this assumption is that they will be, these sanctions that is, upheld indefinitely until we see this sort of change in behavior. And to be fair to the optimists, the fact that we have not seen a crack so far in that consensus since 2014 is impressive, and particularly given the extent of the economic hit that the EU took as a result of the sanctions regime that it imposed on Russia. But the transatlantic consensus on sanctions that existed essentially through the end of the Obama administration is no longer. I would point to two major developments that demonstrate that. And now I'm speaking generally on sanctions, not on Ukraine sanctions specifically. The first is the CAATSA legislation, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which was passed in August, or signed into law in August of last year, which imposed additional unilateral U.S. sanctions on Russia, including some related to Ukraine, most of which is not consistent with EU sanctions policy. And some elements of CAATSA actually have direct implications for European firms. Most specifically and prominently, of course, the provisions that have yet to be implemented, but nonetheless are actively being discussed on sanctions on the companies involved in the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from the gas pipeline that is starting to be built from Russia to Germany. And, of course, the implementation of sanctions on Rusal, the Russia's largest producer of aluminum, which had significant reverberations on European production chains that apparently there wasn't much pre-consultation when those sanctions were implemented back in April here. And the second major element, besides CAATSA, that is driving a wedge in the transatlantic consensus on sanctions is, of course, the U.S. decision to withdraw from the JCPOA, the Iran deal. There is now a dramatic difference of opinion, so to speak, between the U.S. and the EU on the nature of sanctions on Iran and what those sanctions should be. So we're not only seeing different approaches to sanctions, generally speaking, but that there are U.S. sanctions which now essentially target European firms. Now, Ukraine-related sanctions have not been directly affected by this, but the point is that the U.S. and the EU are no longer a fully united front on sanctions, generally speaking, and in some cases they've already adopted opposing stances. Of course, it should be noted, Russia has done more than than anyone in the U.S. or the EU to keep these sanctions going, and I would not put it past Russia to continue with steps that would make that consensus more easy to maintain. But these rifts are developing. Moreover, within the EU, the consensus is weakening. We should note that Angela Merkel, who was really the driving force behind the major decisions that were taken in 2014 on sanctions, is weaker now than she ever has been in her political career. And more importantly, the two parties that make up the governing coalition in Italy, the anti-establishment Five Star and the far-right League, when they formed the government in May, signed a coalition agreement that explicitly called for the lifting of Russia's sanctions. Now, that has yet to be implemented, but just a week ago, when the EU agreed to roll over sanctions against Russian citizens and companies related to the annexation of Crimea, a measure which applies to 155 people and 44 entities, several member states reportedly wanted to make that list longer. And Italy reportedly wanted officials who are no longer in office to be removed from the list. And as a result, Italy said that if no names were to be cut, then no names could be added. Now, of course, that does not mean this episode. It does not mean that sanctions are imminently going to be lifted, particularly if Russia, as I mentioned, continues to help. But it does mean that significant cracks are developing within the EU consensus on this issue. And it suggests that over time, it will become harder and harder to maintain the current policy. So I think we should view the rollback of sanctions, and this is regardless of the situation on the ground in Donbass, as a matter of when and not whether. It might be years from now, but that is another question, really. And so, again, the question of time being on our side here is a dubious one. Now, the assumption behind the whole centrality of sanctions to the optimism is that increasing costs for Russia will cause concessions on Ukraine. Now, there's some logic to this assumption, one would imagine, but there is in fact no evidence for it. And we have seen a lot of evidence since 2014 that Russia is willing to absorb a tremendous cost to pursue its objectives in Ukraine. And the advocates for the effectiveness of sanctions in this context point to deterrence, that is, preventing Russia from having done more than it did as an indication of the sanctions' effectiveness. Now, that, of course, rests on an assumption that Russia, in fact, wanted to do more than it did, and that its decision-making calculus was affected by the measures that were implemented. for which we have no evidence. Although it does sound sort of logical, it is an evidence-free claim. The fourth assumption built into the optimism that I'd like to raise is that, as Keith mentioned, that the Ukrainian military is now more capable than ever before, and that there is thus a low military downside risk of a further Russian incursion because of the cost that the Ukrainians could impose on a Russian invasion. So it is certainly true that Ukraine's capabilities have pretty significantly improved since 2014. But we should not ignore what is going on across the border in the southern and western military districts of Russia, particularly those areas of those districts that border Ukraine. And specifically, since 2014, Russia has essentially moved a significant amount of ground forces, basically to a permanent stationing right along the Ukrainian border. And the capabilities of those forces would make quick work of the Ukrainian military, despite the improvements that we mentioned. The Russian military, that is, have announced a plan to establish 10 ground forces divisions by the end of this year, and 6 of those new divisions are located in the western and southern military districts and most of that along the border with Ukraine. The 20th Combined Arms Army has been moved from the Nizhny Novgorod region to Voronezh, much closer to the border, and also reinforced with 2 new motor rifle brigades and a tank brigade. So it is a picture of a permanent threat that Ukraine faces across the border now that is unlikely to change in the medium to long term. These are permanent moves, not temporary ones. And finally, and Keith touched on this a little bit, I want to question the assumption that the balance of payments in Ukraine can be maintained thanks to external support. So first of all, as Keith mentioned, we're looking at, through 2020, over $30 billion of external and internal debt repayment, which, by the way, is over a third of Ukraine's GDP. So the other news that has come in the last day is that there looks to be unlikely that there will be another IMF tranche this year, and the program itself will, of course, cease in March of next year unless it is modified, which is possible, of course, but we are reaching a sort of critical juncture. So, to take a step back, we've now hopefully punctured some of the optimistic balloons that are out there about the future of this conflict and the situation and whether time is in fact on our side. But what does that all mean? And our, in this case, I suppose, both the West and Ukraine's. I would argue that there needs to be a greater sense of urgency surrounding the conflict settlement in this context. And we don't see that urgency. There has not been a meeting between the U.S. Special Envoy for Ukraine negotiations and his Russian counterpart in all of 2018. We might want to rethink the idea that we have all the leverage in this context. Because if our argument that we made here today is right, compromise now is likely to be less painful than compromise later.
Thanks very much, Sam. Maybe I'll add just one observation on the Russian military, and particularly in the southern and western military districts. There have been very sweeping changes in the leadership of the Russian military because Russia is kind of rotating its senior officers and also lower level officers through Syria. And you've got really 60,000 at this point Russian officers who have combat experience from Syria who didn't before. And you're seeing, at least so far as I can tell, and we've got Olga and others who follow the Russian military really closely here, but at least so far as I can tell, a Russian military that's in a very different place in terms of its ability to execute what we would call joint warfare, than it used to be in the past. Anyway, let's open it up for questions. Anybody have one? James?
James,
if you could please identify
I'm
yourselves.
a contributing editor in Atlantic Media and a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Presidency in Congress. So it raises a question of what you say that the pressure of the election is going to force them to try to make a constitutional amendment that steers them towards NATO in the West. Does NATO in the West sitting with open arms for that? Because it seems to me the message has been sent twice now in Georgia and Ukraine that Russia has figured out that NATO's not going to let in a member that it guts and thus decreases the security of the alliance because it has Russian troops on its territory. So, I mean, what would you advise NATO at this point vis-a-vis this idea of Ukraine leaping into our arms? Because it seems to me that would cause a huge problem for NATO.
Okay. I think we need to make explicit statements, which we have in the past, that NATO membership for Ukraine is not on the table at this time, and EU membership is obviously a complete fantasy at this time. And so I think rather than saying encouraging things and talking about the Budapest Memorandum and all sorts of things that imply some kind of security commitment to Ukraine that might be augmented, those are the sorts of things that just embolden the government in a way that's not likely to lead to a good outcome or a settlement. So we need to tamp it down, basically.
Anything to add?
I would just note that in none of the Central and Eastern European states that joined NATO and the EU since 1991 was there a constitutional clause committing their countries to doing so. So I think this is sort of a largely political endeavor that could be coming in the context of trying to run a very divisive presidential campaign and could have significant long-term consequences.
Corey.
Thanks, Corey Well, Congressional Research Service. A question and for Keith, and then a general comment. The question is, Keith, so I agree with the analysis. So thank you for all the remarks. I was surprised that you didn't include the question of increased far-right activities in recent months, and I would think that would be an easy add to your basket of negativity in Ukraine. My general remark would be to consider a slight reframing of this notion that there's a lot of optimism out there. I think, Sam, what you're saying about Russia, I would agree that there's a lot of folks who think that that time is on our side with respect to Russian development. I don't hear a whole lot of sense that things are going well in Ukraine and they're only improving, and particularly with regard to the administration. When you see a lot of criticism, and I think what you're expressing is an answer to the question of, well, what can we do about it? And then we're left with this sort of conventional dilemma, which is, well, the Ukrainians are the ones that we're rooting for, and so we need to help prop them up. And so the debate really needs to be not about whether things are going well or not in Ukraine, but about whether there are things that we can do differently given the situation. I think, again, what you're hearing is an expression of optimism, which is hiding the fact that there might be people that don't know what else to do.
Any reaction?
On the far right, yeah, I could have brought that up, but it's sort of the far right activity is interesting in the sense that there's a lot of street violence, just sort of attacking the Roma, attacking politicians, but the main problem is that they are the backbone of the security services at this point. That there are these far right networks that have penetrated the Ministry of Internal Affairs and certain parts of the army, and that's always a coup risk, I think, in the event of certain electoral outcomes. But I think that on your broader point, I think that one way to frame it is exactly that the way we would like to help Ukraine, but the way we help Ukraine and have helped Ukraine in the past has has undermined their stability, either by foregrounding their entry to the West, right, trying to make empty commitments to them that NATO and the EU are there for them, and that splits Ukraine internally in a very pernicious way, or in giving them money, which feeds this beast, which makes them unsustainable. The problem is the alternative to that. They're very good at chicken, right? They basically bring themselves to the brink of disaster, and it's not in our interest to see Ukraine completely go under. Right? And so that's what we've been trying to do to get them to raise their gas tariffs, to do these reforms, but it hasn't been successful. So I think the stick has to show up, and we can't keep talking carrot.
Sam, let me play a little bit devil's advocate with you on the Russian economy. And, you're certainly right that it's basically stabilized, and that it's stabilized on the positive side, in the sense that, it does look like there's real growth. But at the same time, it's basically a stagnant economy. I think a lot of Russians see it as a stagnant economy. The macroeconomic policies were very successful in dealing with the crisis, but there were really significant cuts in Russian government expenditures that affect quality of life of people who live in the country. And from a perspective of kind of Russian domestic politics and attitudes of people toward the government, and I'm using government here in kind of a narrower sense of the Prime Minister and the cabinet, rather than perhaps the whole government of the Russian Federation. Don't you think that there could be actually some more pressure internally?
So I'll get to that in 1 second. I do want to. Corey asked a good question about can we do things differently. I did suggest towards the end of my remarks one concrete thing, which is having more of a sense of urgency about the diplomatic track and conflict settlement. If we do, if you do buy our argument that time is not on our side, then that could clearly be changed. And I don't think we should discount that. But I also want to return to this question of, whether or not people making statements on behalf of the U.S. government or the legislative branch believe the optimism about that they are often articulating. So I would say that even if behind the scenes, off the record, there is more concern, skepticism about particularly the domestic developments and Poroshenko's ability to deliver on all these promises, the public optimism has a pernicious effect because it is used in the domestic Ukrainian political context, and it also, I think, undermines any private messages of, pushing these people, because they don't have the public. In public, they're being told, and they can point to statements that say, they're doing a great job. So I think that's an important factor here too. So on the question of stagnant economy, I mean, the U.S. for many years has been growing between 1% and 2%, and we don't call that stagnant. It's still growth. Now, of course, the base is dramatically different, and Russia's a tenth of the size of the U.S. economy. I wouldn't want to compare the two. And Russia does need more growth in order to return to household income levels of pre-2014. There's no question about that Russia faces significant economic challenges in the years ahead. My only point was that if we are betting on a Russian economic collapse, there is not much, that is a long shot bet, and not a one that I think you would put high odds on. But I do think it is important to note that, and this perhaps connects to another element of potential optimism that might be emerging. There is more politics in Russia now. The sort of rally around the flag effect of the Crimea annexation and the sort of besieged fortress mentality of the post-2014 Russian political reality, I think, is fading somewhat, and we are seeing, in some cases, and particularly in focus groups, a return to some of the discontent that was present in public opinion data in the 2011-2012 period. I would just caution that this is also not a sign of an imminent collapse of the political system. We're much more, I mean, I think, that's not to say that it's entirely stable, but we shouldn't mistake a little bit more politics for, imminent regime collapse.
Wayne, sorry, you've been very patient. I have a list of like 5 people here, so please be patient with me in coming to each of you. Yes.
Thank you, Paul. Wayne Mary, the American Foreign Policy Council. I've been going to Ukraine fairly regularly since 1982. And in my last couple of visits, including for a couple of weeks this spring, much of what I saw and heard would confirm Keith's report, which is there really is some good news, particularly in areas that Western visitors like to look at and ask about. But then out among the Ukrainian population, 3/4 of the people tell pollsters they think the country's going in the wrong direction. The country's prosperity heavily depends on remittances from Ukrainians who can now travel visa-free and work fairly easily in Poland and other parts of Europe. And basically the place where Ukraine fatigue is most alive and well is in the population of Ukraine itself. But what I want to press Keith on is next year is a very big political year in Ukraine. It's not just presidential elections, it's also national parliamentary elections. What I've heard is that there's a lot of good young talent out in the provinces in Ukraine. I've met some of it. But at the national level, it's the same old, same old. This is still a country where the oligarchs rule the state rather than the other way around. And that the strategy for both Poroshenko and Tymoshenko is identical. They both want to do whatever is necessary to get into the second round on their logic that if you're in the second round, you run as the centrist candidate, the safe pair of hands. But they're both doing that, aiming at much of a significant part of the same part of the electorate. I'd like you to discuss a little more how what seems to me, particularly after my most recent visit, that 2019 is going to be a very big year in Ukrainian political history. I don't know whether it's going to be a crisis year, but things are going to have to sort out in some ways, and I'd like you to discuss that a little more. One of the things I heard a lot was, first, Poroshenko is on the phone with Vladimir Putin at least once or twice a week. We know that. We don't know what they're talking about. Some people, when you ask them, they look at you and they say, money. But other people say that they're trying to work a deal that would allow Poroshenko to run as the successful peace candidate, the guy who got the Donbass back. Not Crimea, but the Donbass. I'd like you to talk a little more about what you've been hearing from people that you talk to, is the strategy and the probability of how this Poroshenko, Tymoshenko, and then a number of these other competitors out there, most of whom are relatively unknown in the United States, but increasingly known in Ukraine, how that's going to work out. Because I think a year from now, the political scene in Ukraine is going to be, in one way or another, several different ways, fundamentally different than it is now, and I'd like you to sort of prognosticate on that a little bit, if you would, please.
Okay, great question. I'm hearing things a little differently on settlement of the crisis before the elections. My sort of ear to the street is that Russia's waiting for the outcome, and that they are not going to help Poroshenko, and that Poroshenko is taking a line essentially to get into the second round. That part I entirely agree with you. That that both a sort of an extreme, sort of pro-Western position to pull votes in the west and center of the country, and administrative resources will hopefully get him into the second round. But coming up from 8% is hard, even if Yulia Tymoshenko's only at 12, or if you count expected voters, it goes from Poroshenko getting 12% and Yulia getting about 19%. Right? Those are still. It's going to be tough to get into the second round, and it's highly uncertain. If there were a deal in the offing, it would be exactly along the lines, and this is what the U.S. government maybe should be promoting, is decentralization. I agree with you completely that the talent is in the provinces and the corruption is in the center. And that part of the virtue of a more decentralized Ukraine is that you're moving the game out to the provinces where it's likely to function better than it has in the past. And that's something that could come out of a, Minsk negotiation process as well. Now, Poroshenko's people say that we can't do that, right? We wouldn't want to do that, but we can't do it because we're constrained. That's seen as a concession, and we can't make concessions. But if you look at this most recent survey, which is fantastic, right? 60% of the population supports a diplomatic settlement. Decentralization is supported by a significant majority of the population. Only 8% of the population thinks that Ukraine is better off without the Donbass, and only 11% of the population thinks that you should take it back by force, right? There's a lot of room for settlement at this point, and this is where I agree with Sam, right? That, we should be pushing settlement now, because I agree, 2019, there's a lot of variance here. It could go very wildly wrong from a U.S. interests standpoint. And having Poroshenko enter those elections as the candidate of peaceful settlement, as he, was promising in 2014, would be a great outcome for us, and great outcome for Ukraine. But I don't think that's what's happening. I don't think that's what's in the works. And partly it's because we're telling Ukraine that we have their back.
Right here, yes.
Barry Blackman, Stimson Center. Thank you. The sort of logical outcome of the trends the two of you have described is that if there is a period of turmoil or a coup following the election, that the Russians would be greatly tempted to invade the country and seize the rest of the south and east, which is occupied by Russian-speaking Orthodox people. Would you say there would be a high risk of that?
So in the sense that it's possible, like there's the laws of physics wouldn't prevent it. Sure, I think we've seen though that Russia. So the fact that there has not been further incursions into Ukraine is not a function of the military balance. It's a function of Russia not wanting to do it. So if we operating from that basis, we would have to. There'd have to be an incentive for Russia to want to enlarge the rebel-held territories, or just simply to invade. My guess is that they're going to. I mean, the posture they've sort of taken is sort of sitting back and watching things develop in Ukraine. I think from their perspective, time is on their side, and therefore they don't feel the need to do things urgently. I mean, when Russia feels that time isn't on its side vis-a-vis Ukraine, we see bad things happen, like the invasion and annexation of Crimea. And so, in a way, I think maybe their optimism is, in this case, perhaps consistent with peace. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think that if there's a coup and this sort of far-right veins that penetrate, right, these are the conditions under which it would be likely.
Yeah.
I think is that if there is a coup by the far right after the election, and Ukraine, to its credit, other than 2013, has changed power through elections every time. Right? And so it's these extra constitutional, extra electoral things that have caused trouble. That's what was so problematic about 2013, 2014, was that the government was overthrown, right, outside of an election. And half the population didn't support the Maidan. And so that creates the conditions for Russian intervention. If we see something like that again, where the losing side in an election essentially mounts a coup to save Ukraine, then you could see Russian involvement, and you might see willingness on the part of the population. I mean, this is why they were successful in Crimea, is that the head of the Ukrainian Navy defected to the Russian side, bringing all of his ships with him. Right? You need a lot of compliance and support from within Ukraine for a successful intervention of that type. but only under extreme circumstances do I think we'd see that kind of support.
All right, John, Glenn.
Hi, John Glenn with the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Thank you for your cheerful presentation. It seems to me that until recently, much of the debate here about the options on Ukraine was sort of driven by this agonizing debate about the logic of escalation. Particularly, we saw that around, lethal force or not lethal force, and the kind of sense that it was as if this barometer that we went this way, but the Russians could always do more because they cared more than we did. Was that wrong? Or how are we saying, is that logic at all playing out in terms of the options that we see people looking at in terms of what to do with Ukraine?
And John, I assume you're referring here to the delivery of the anti-tank Javelin missiles in this context. As it turns out, that wasn't escalatory. So I don't know that we've tested whether we have escalation control. I mean, in a way, it was delivered in such a way as to be have the least impact possible on the military situation on the ground. They're sort of under lock and key on the other side of the country, therefore, I think it's not that so the question is really not whether the lack of a response to the Javelin delivery in itself tells us that, in fact, Russia doesn't have escalation control. I just don't think they viewed that step and the way it was taken as a dramatic escalation. Now, I think the problem with that is that it thus might open the floodgates to a certain extent, and there will be those in this town who will be tempted to use the lack of a Russian significant response directly, at least, to the delivery of the Javelins, to say, well, we should be, providing more and more lethal and more, and, I think that's where you potentially could run into trouble.
I think there's a reasonable difference of opinion on this point, which is that, do you, by backing Ukraine militarily, increase the cost for the Russians and get them to back down, or is that the thing that makes Russia really feel like its security interests are threatened and lead them to escalate and get involved? And I think that Sam's right that the Javelins is a test. Maybe nobody felt that that was sufficient. But there's been talk in the last couple of weeks about rebuilding the Ukrainian Navy and trying to, reestablish control over, the Sea of Azov, things like that. That's probably falling into the category of the Russians might assert escalation dominance. And they do have it. We weren't wrong that they have escalation dominance.
I'm going to express actually a third opinion because I have a personal view on this also. I think part of the equation when you're thinking about what costs is Russia prepared to bear in Ukraine is what is the purpose of the expenditure, right? What are they paying the cost in order to achieve? What does the Russian population, the Russian government see as the goal of their behavior? And I would kind of argue if the goal is to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO or to prevent the United States from building a big military base and sending a bunch of American troops to Ukraine or something like that, I'm picking something kind of extravagant, I suspect Russia would be willing to pay a higher cost for things like that than Russia is prepared to pay in the current situation, where I think you basically have stagnated conflict. And from the perspective of many people in the Russian population, this is kind of Putin's optional project that hasn't failed, but also hasn't quite succeeded. And the cost that somebody is willing to pay for that, perhaps not so high. So when I think about escalation, I'm thinking actually not just about kind of the dynamics of who does what on either side, but how did the two sides actually think about what is happening and where it might go, and how does that affect what they might be willing to do. That's just to throw another else who I missed? Linda?
Anton Fedyarshin, American University. We're being overrepresented here today, three of us. Question for Keith and for Sam. Internally, Keith, is the possibility of Ukraine becoming a bridge nation between Russia and the West completely dead at this point? Because there was a possibility for that until the country was forced to make a choice, which cleft it, of course. And for Sam, there's a narrative emerging in Russia that for NATO, Ukrainian instability and the argument, not for its membership, but for what the Russians have done and or allegedly have done in Ukraine, being a reason for NATO to sort of close up ranks and increase expenditures, that this is one of the mechanisms behind the whole Ukraine crisis. And the Russians have an argument that goes like this. When you look at NATO as an operations conducting organization, there aren't really many successful operations you can point to, Afghanistan, Libya being the two most prominent examples. But if you look at NATO as a military standoff organization that doesn't conduct operations, but that just exists in order to consolidate opinion, it's been much more successful over the past, 60-odd years. Is that kind of interpretation completely off base from the Russian side? Thank you.
All right.
Keith? So I think the main impediment to Ukraine being a bridge is that it's two bulwarks, right? So you have a very anti-Russian West and a very anti-NATO South and East. And so I think that it's not going to be a bridge, but you can downplay the importance of choosing to keep the country together, and it can have a non-block status very effectively, I think. But it's a complicated thing to keep the country together. It's not going to and reach out in either of those directions in any substantial way.
Sam?
Just want to return to the question of military assistance for 1 second. So one important question that needs to be asked in this context is what exactly is the objective behind delivery of a particular weapon system or certain assistance program, contemplation of more lethal aid in this context. And one could imagine a number of different objectives, but if our objective is to help rebuild the Ukrainian armed forces, then anti-tank weapons would be nowhere near the top of the list of things that could be done to help. And Olga Holker can speak in detail about the other things on that list. If we're trying to forge a settlement and bring it into the conflict, would delivery of anti-tank weapons further that outcome? Well, at least they haven't so far. So the question then becomes, what exactly are they, what is the objective behind the policy of focusing on particularly that assistance via that delivery of that weapon system? So NATO exists in significant part to defend its members. It's a collective security organization. And I think, the train has long left the station on reinforcement of NATO's east, and that even if there were to be tomorrow a settlement in Ukraine, the steps that the alliance has taken to reinforce the members who are closer to Russia would proceed, because Russia's done a lot of stuff besides Ukraine in the interim that has increased Allied threat perceptions. So I don't think that I don't think the conspiracy theory really holds. Olga.
Thank you. So one comment and then my question. I'm going to also push back on the optimism argument. I was at the misnamed Yalta European Security Conference. I mean, some of it's misnamed on several grounds. Last week, I missed Bono because I had an ear infection. but I managed to attend a few of the sessions before, and one of the things I find is there's a public optimism, right? There's this certain members of the Western community get together with certain members of the Ukrainian community, and they lift their hands up high, joined, and we're going to fight the Russians together, and they all agree, and it's all very optimistic. But then you take any of the Ukrainians, or for that matter, any of the Westerners aside, and you ask them what's going on, and they're all incredibly depressed. So, I mean, I think I think this is so, and it's not as though if you turn on Ukrainian television, which I have to admit I almost never do because I don't like television, but what I'm told is that it's also not actually that upbeat, and you don't just have to watch the Russian language channels to get that. So my question, though, is, so we get an election, somebody gets elected. What happens next in terms of prospects for a settlement? And I mean, I have my own opinions on what happens next, but this is the conversation I kept having on the sidelines of the conference, and I'm not, I'm curious what you guys both think.
Well, I think it resolves, once you have the outcome of an election, and if it sticks, it resolves some of the uncertainty that is preventing a settlement now, right? Where the Russians can think that maybe they'll get a better arrangement, and we think that we can also get a better arrangement. But a lot depends on who that person is, whether you get a settlement or not, right? And one can never trust what Yulia Tymoshenko says, as opposed
Even
to
though she says the same thing.
right. We don't know what she'll actually do in power, and it's interesting because she is leading the polling in every region of Ukraine, which I find fascinating. But publicly, she's talking a bellicose line. Publicly, she's saying, we don't need Minsk because we have Budapest, which means that we should have external support for the reestablishment of our territorial integrity. Right?
From Russia.
Yeah. So, so I think that part of the difficulty of this time is that we really don't know what is. It depends on who comes out on top, whether we get a settlement. If Poroshenko wins, I think there's a good chance we get a settlement.
So I think also it is possible that the nature of the campaign will have an impact on the prospects for settlement afterwards.
Yeah, that's true.
We now see the two leading candidates trying to outdo themselves in positioning their candidacies as far away from a settlement as possible. I mean, Poroshenko, as Keith mentioned, sort of campaigning on the independence of the Kiev Patriarchy and the constitutional amendment, is not leaving much ground for that. I would say, it's hard for me to imagine the rhetoric and discourse changing so dramatically as to really facilitate the kind of settlement that is envisioned in the Minsk agreements and the text of the documents after the election. It has gone the sort of acceptable discourse on the settlement among Ukrainian political elites, particularly as they speak in public, is so, extreme probably isn't the right word, but so far removed from the commitments made in the Minsk agreements that it's sort of hard to imagine them suddenly speaking of, devolution of power and, the right for these certain regions of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast to appoint their own police and prosecutors. However, there does seem to be this pattern in the region of waiting for the outcome of an election to move forward on a settlement process. We were first waiting for the outcome of the Russian presidential election. Before that, we were waiting for the outcome of the U.S. presidential election. Now we're waiting for the outcome of the Ukrainian presidential election. So, in a way, when we're doing that, it seems to me that that demonstrates that there's sort of a lack of organic momentum towards settlement. But I would be interested to know what you heard, if you're willing to share.
Yeah, I just want to add one other thing, too, which is on this optimism issue. I think there's an optimism in not appreciating the downside risks also. So it's more insufficient pessimism than optimism. But if you think about 2013 and where we were 5 years ago, people just didn't imagine that within several months Crimea would be gone and the Donbass would be occupied, right? They didn't conceive of this as a possibility. I mean, some of us did, and some of us talked about it because we're very sensitive to the regional divisions in Ukraine. And I think there's some of that now, which is, well, the worst is the status quo. The worst isn't the status quo. And that's a kind of, well, it can, if you think it can only go up from here, maybe you'll roll those dice. But it can get worse.
Now I want to ask a follow-up question, but I'll encourage you both to be brief because we have 3 other people who want to ask questions. So let's imagine actually that there is a settlement. Does that make Ukrainian politics better? And what I have in mind specifically is you have a settlement. You have these devastated regions in the east. You have a central government that will have to find a way to allocate resources to reconstruction in those regions. You have a lot of other regions of Ukraine which are not sympathetic to the populations in those regions and which also have their own needs. And it strikes me that the external financial support for Ukraine, while I imagine there would be some following a settlement, my assumption is that it will be far less than the actual needs of Ukraine for a variety of reasons, not limited actually to the corruption problem that you mentioned. Very brief.
So, of course, the answer to that question depends on the nature of the settlement. It's hard to imagine, even in a vacuum, Minsk being implemented to the letter. It's hard to answer that question. I would imagine that there would be significantly greater EU, particularly willingness to finance reconstruction, if there were a genuine settlement. But I think it's important to note that, and Sergei Kudelia wrote an excellent paper recently for the Kennan Institute about the nature of the institutional changes that would be necessary to really facilitate a settlement involving significant devolution of policymaking authority from Kiev to the regions, and that has yet to happen. So I think that would be a key, within Ukraine, which is only sort of a part of the question regarding a settlement, of course, means of ensuring long-term stability if it were to be implemented. Otherwise, you'd have this dramatically asymmetric confederal structure that would cause significant resentment in other parts of the country too.
Yeah, I think a settlement would improve politics in Ukraine, and particularly if it's based on decentralization for the same reasons in my response to Wayne's question. But I do think that that is genuinely good for Ukraine, that if you have a country with these kinds of regional divisions, like Canada, there are others out there, Belgium, right? Devolution of authority to a regional or local level solves some of those problems. And remember, the fundamental DNA of the Ukrainian government in Kiev needs to change, right? This isn't, if I want to make one point today, it's that this is an unsustainable system without significant external financial assistance to keep the pot full. And so, if you don't address, and that pot gets kept full in part by stoking the fires of threat and war. And so if you have a settlement, they're going to have to make changes.
Grover, you had
What
a quick...
what authority are you talking about devolving that would split the country?
So cultural and language policy, so control over education would be a big one. And taxes.
They make everybody study in Ukrainian?
Yes, there's a centrally controlled Ministry of Education.
Religion?
Religion isn't controlled by the state, but Poroshenko is trying to centralize control over all of the Orthodox churches under the Kiev Patriarchate. That's what's been happening this month, and that is very disruptive.
There's a Moscow-headed Orthodox church, and there's a Kiev-headed Orthodox church.
Yeah, and a lot of property and priests associated with each of those.
All right, George, and then let's see. Well, George, you go. I'll look at my list.
Thanks, George Beebe, Center for International Interest. My question is, can Ukraine really achieve a meaningful and durable settlement outside the broader context of a redefined European security arrangement? there's a great deal of unfinished business as related to that. And Ukraine, in many sense, has been caught in the middle of that lack of agreement as to what the European security architecture will look like. Russia has found itself on the outside, in a way incentivized to disrupt the formation of a new architecture that doesn't include Russia. Sam, you've written, I think, some very interesting things about this question. And I wonder if you can address whether the approach that seeks to settle Ukraine first and put off some sort of understanding on the broader European context is really realistic.
I'll leave that one to you.
Tough question, of course. I think, we were sort of asked to address it in the question of a settlement in a vacuum today. But if we are to open the aperture a bit wider, I would say that it would certainly dramatically facilitate, increase the chances of a settlement if there were to be a parallel track of a renegotiated, or at least some sort of agreement on the security architecture. Now, that is so unlikely because of the politics of the moment right now that one could imagine a sort of temporary ceasefire kind of settlement. In other words, the settlement itself is implemented, but it represents a ceasefire in the broader conflict over the regional order in that part of Europe. And so there could be, again, conflict in the future if, the nature of the sort of Russia-West conflict were to heat up, and particularly as it concerns Ukraine. But it would be a sort of, at least, temporary lessening of the pressure and easing of the humanitarian conditions on the ground and the economic burden that Ukraine is facing as a result. So I think it's possible, but it would be much, much, much more likely under the circumstances that you mentioned. It's just those circumstances are so remote right now that it's certainly worth a try doing it this way. I mean, I would say practically, if taking into account the political situation the way it is, one problem I think with the policy that to a certain extent, both the U.S. and the EU have adopted since 2014, of basically saying no talks on the broader questions of European security until Minsk is implemented. Now that's sort of changed in that there is this thing called a structured dialogue within the OSCE, but as one can imagine, with a name like that, and the venue being what it is, we're not talking about high-level talks on the most sensitive issues. So if there were to be a parallel track, Minsk proceeding in its own, or the Ukraine settlement in on its own track, and a parallel track of at least talks on the underlying fundamental divides that are to a significant extent driving the external powers as concerns the Ukraine settlement, I think that would be a positive development, regardless of the practical result. It might just ease tensions, perhaps, and facilitate a settlement in the context of Ukraine. Now, all that having been said, there are two sides of this coin, and Keith, and the fact that we covered the internal and the external, I think sort of alludes to that. Even if there were to be magically a, détente and some sort of agreement on the European security architecture, there are internal elements of the settlement in Ukraine that would have to be worked out regardless. And that's true the other way around, of course, which I think is what George was pointing out.
I had kind of an idea for a long time, and I don't know how realistic it is because I don't really know Ukrainian politics, but actually I thought if you want to do something to the Ukrainian constitution, if you set up the Ukrainian constitution such that joining any multilateral body would require kind of a favorable vote by a certain number of regions of Ukraine, for example. So the country would only be able to join a multilateral group if it was something that truly represented something approaching a national consensus. But that's just my ignorant musing. Lyndon Allen, we had you next.
Thanks, yep. fantastic presentations, and I think there's a lot of, sometimes I call it magical thinking, as opposed to optimism. I wanted to mention, Paul, your comment about the costs and what Russia thinks it may be paying for. I was in Moscow recently, not to talk about these issues with anybody, but my sort of informal focus group of folks I interacted with a couple of times surprised me by referring to Crimea and saying, oh, well, you guys were going to put a naval base there, that's unacceptable. And so that's already sort of in the narrative. And I know you guys know that, but I think the folks in DC don't really understand that because it seems, perhaps a little bit outlandish. But it's very important to understand how the folks over there think about this stuff. I look at the situation in Ukraine, including the proposed constitutional amendments, through the lens of my work in Moldova in the past. That similar constitutional amendments have been proposed there. In that case, it was, they have more of a geopolitics as domestic politics problem, I would say, than Ukraine does, although Ukraine also suffers from it. And I guess the dilemma, and I'm not really sure what to do about it, but I would appreciate your thoughts on it, is how does the U.S. and EU, NATO, whatever Western term is being used, prevent itself from being co-branded with people who are seen domestically as kleptocrats in some cases, right? How do you get into a situation where, I don't know, it just seems like this is a naked effort to sort of tattoo your beloved's name on your arm, and then, well, of course, we can never dump them then. And I just, I wonder what the suitable way to push back against this is. You said clear public statements. I was told that one Moldovan political party was recently asked by some EU politicians not to use the EU flag in their campaign. That's obviously not necessarily something that they can control. So that's one just thought is what is to be done on that issue. And also, I'm curious, you talk about decentralization. I think you have a much clearer view of the polling and public opinion and political party platforms. Is anybody really talking about that in an engaged way as part of the campaign or in public discourse in Ukraine, or is it viewed as an issue with a particular valence that is sort of explicitly partisan on one side or another? Thanks.
On the last point, no, I don't think anyone is pushing it as a campaign issue, but maybe that will shift at some point. I haven't followed the detailed campaigns of the people getting under 5% of the vote, but that's a lot of people actually. So the top vote, top polling is 12%. So there's a lot of campaigning out there that I might be missing. In terms of you don't want to spoil the West's brand.
That's right.
Right. By tying it to particular people who may not be good. But the only way to do that is to stop backing those people. And a quiet statement to a Moldovan political party not to use the EU flag. I think there needs to be a clearer statement that look, you guys you're not on the path, right? The path looks like you creating governance institutions that make people want to invest and produce, because you don't have oil, and you don't have non-ferrous metals, you don't have all of these things that would be required to be a truly kleptocratic regime.
Sustainably kleptocratic.
Sustainably kleptocratic. And
They're truly kleptocratic.
yeah, that's true. Sustainably kleptocratic. And we just haven't had the courage to do it.
So I'm glad that we have in political science today this new term of
Sustainable
kleptocracy.
Yeah.
Right. Sam.
I think that this is an unfortunate and inevitable consequence of having our entire policy towards the region be framed around the geopolitical conflict with Russia.
Yeah.
It is just going to happen over and over again that people like Poroshenko, people whose practices we would not approve of, are going to present themselves as our guys in the battle against our strategic competitor and Russian aggression, et cetera, et cetera. They're going to wrap themselves in the American, NATO, EU flag. You pick it, and there's not going to be the willingness to, dump them as a result of the fact that really increasingly both U.S. and EU policy is to a ever greater extent framed around countering malign, quote-unquote, Russian influence throughout the region.
It would help a lot if the Russians were less aggressive too.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, of course.
But I'm just saying we're in this
Yeah.
conflict.
Yeah.
And perhaps much of Russian influence is malign, but I think we're going to have to view this. I think it's impossible to get out of that scenario if we're going to be framing our policy in the way it's currently being framed.
One here, and then Grover, and then Jacob, and why don't we just take all
Thank you.
three, and then we'll let the panel.
Peter Robert, George Washington University. I wanted to ask you about the year 2016. So in the fall of 2016, we were told that the Poroshenko government was very nervous about the unlikely event of Donald Trump winning the election, because the expectation was that then there would be a complete divestment from Ukraine, complete change, and so on and so on. This obviously didn't happen, and so all of these fears have been calmed down. But do you see a continuity or a discontinuity, and if so, in what aspects, between, let's say, the strategy and tactics of Victoria Nuland, John Kerry on the one hand, and Rex Tillerson and Kurt Volker and Mike Pompeo on the other hand? Is this just the same as was? Part of it seems to have become more invisible. It seems to me that recently there has been a lot less talk about Ukraine policy, but can you differentiate between the Obama administration and the Trump administration in regards to their Ukraine policy?
Grover,
How much of the Russia interaction with Ukraine is actually also having a conversation with the Baltic states or the stands and watch us here, because they don't want to back off. But whatever happening here could happen somewhere else, and that's part of the conversation. That's why this is a bigger deal.
demonstrative action. Jacob,
Far away from my
project your voice.
Either way, I didn't know if you were taping this. My question is directed solely at Keith, who has commented earlier in the New Yorker. I recall reading you on the issue of compromat and Trump. And the reason I ask is because about 2 months ago, there was speculation in the media that Ukraine was suppressing either at the overt or explicit or implicit behest of the Trump administration information about Paul Manafort's activities in Ukraine. And now Manafort has, of course, flipped. I wonder, I'm just curious, what is the status of your own thinking, as it were, on this issue of compromat and how it might affect Ukraine?
And I'll kind of throw into the mix. Politico reported just 2 or 3 months after our presidential election that the Ukrainian government was trying to help Hillary Clinton, and there was some various activities that they undertook here in Washington toward that end during the campaign. Keith?
Yeah, so I think that they did, by most accounts, Poroshenko quietly indicated directly to the president that those issues would go away, right? And that's classic compromat behavior, right? Like, we're going to keep this material, you don't need to worry about that, right? And thank you for the javelins. We look forward to continued support. And so this is kind of the answer to the question. I don't think there's whereas the Obama administration, not Obama himself, but certainly his immediate subordinates, Nuland and others, was very much along the lines of, you're a Poland free and we need to push the boundaries and we need to support Ukraine. I think that de facto Ukraine has learned how to work this particular administration quite well. Both the current one, yeah. And so that leads to a certain continuity of support for Ukraine across both administrations, but the reasons for it are quite different. So I hope that answers your question in a way that doesn't really cause problems for me. But yeah, one of the things when you write about compromise is you start to get denials of your visas. And for Grover's question, I think that showing resolve to the Baltics, Article 5 is a different animal, right? NATO membership is a different animal. And I don't think that we, by not backing up Ukraine under the peculiar circumstances under which Russia ended up acquiring the Crimea and got involved in the Donbass, removes our credibility on the Baltic states. I think we just need to repeatedly assert that NATO is a different animal and that we're going to defend the Baltic states. The stands, the stands took a different path, right? The stands, Kazakhstan has maintained a very good relationship with Russia, even though, it's got a very concentrated ethnic Russian population in its north. And as a result of that, there are no questions about maintaining Kazakh territorial integrity, right? There aren't these threats. Kazakhstan isn't, it balances the relationship very well. It's the bridge for Anton, It bridges China and Russia, it bridges us and Russia, it manages those relationships quite well.
As does Armenia, may I add, by the way. It also has an association agreement and has managed both EU and Russia beautifully, actually.
Yeah,
And
but
very
Ukraine's peculiar internal political geography makes that impossible for them, or difficult for them. You just have to reduce the salience of those external ties.
Sam, anything from you?
I think he
No,
said it
no
all.
last thought. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us.